Hi, and welcome to my second video in my series about how to learn. In the previous video, we started talking about the way I approach learning and how I divide my thought process, my approach to a new subject into concepts and details. And I talked about how these details can be predicted from understanding the concepts and how the concepts can be also, retro-predicted or realized by understanding the details. And that most learning sources provide the details and you need to infer these concepts from. Sometimes, and there's a proportion of details that you cannot really predict from the concept, and that's portion that I call random details. Details with little patterns in them that can help you predict them with a lower amount of effort. In today's video, I'm going to talk about something known as active learning. This is not a concept that I have created, but it's a concept that I've realized I've been using without knowing. Active learning. So, what is active learning? Now, learning by itself is a process that human beings do all the time, unconsciously or consciously. When you want to consciously learn something, it is very important that you know what your goal of learning. What's the purpose of this learning experience? And the goal decides the level of investment that you're going to put into this learning process. For example, if you're having a social interaction with someone that is, and this person is telling you about their job, and they work in a field that is completely different from your own field, but they're just explaining to you what they do just to pass on this social interaction. You're sitting next to each other, you just want to pass time. So they tell you these details about their work, and you can hear them or see them, etc. And this is the most basic method of sensing the existence of that person. You just hear them. If you want to push it a little further, you listen to them. And listening is pretty much figuring out that this voice coming from this person is actually words and ideas rather than just a noise. And by listening, you start to segregate the voice and the sounds that this person is making into words. And actually, by just listening, you're not really learning about their job. You cannot repeat what they said. You're just listening to what they said, and you're not really paying attention. But if you push it a little further, and you pay more attention to what they say, you probably are learning now. And again, if you're not really interested, and your goal of this social interaction is just to pass this, social interaction, then you're not going to invest a lot of your mental work into what they are trying to tell you. And what level of learning are you going to use? What you're going to do most of the times is that your brain is going to look at what this person said and say, well, this person said that they work as a project manager, okay? And they said that what they do as a project manager is that they plan a project before, and then when they plan the project, they choose the people and the resources that are going to be used in executing this project, and then they make sure that the project satisfies the goals. So that's what a project manager is, according to that person. When you're doing this very basic level of learning, your brain can know what ideas have been mentioned in this conversation, not only just listening to it. So your brain can tell, well, this person said that he works as a manager for projects. What he does is plan. He's involved in getting resources. He's involved in getting people. and he makes sure that the project is executed, satisfying its goals. In this fashion, your brain is collecting ideas and is trying to make a thought, a memory of them, that can help you understand what this person does. And one memory, for example, is that you know someone that does a similar job, and your brain just going to record that this person works like that person. Or your memory can simply be that this person has a boring job, or not a boring job, etc. What your brain is doing at this very superficial level of learning is something that I can describe as interpretation. Rather than listening, your brain is trying to use alternative language to describe the ideas they've just heard. By the end of the conversation, your brain will tell you, okay, we understand what has been said. This person has a boring job. If by the end of the conversation, your brain says, okay, we understand, we have an interpretation of what has been said, then you've done the most basic form of learning. This is passive learning. And what do I mean by passive learning? Well, passive learning essentially is the simplest, the least effort form of learning. In passive learning, what you're doing is that you're just interpreting and understanding the ideas that are being presented. So here's a learning source, which in that case was the person talking to you. And this source was, sent to your brain. It was interpreted and understood. And to many people, they think, well, that's a good achievement. But in fact, it's very not effective. Passive learning is the simplest form of learning. And what I mean by passive, I mean that your brain is doing very little effort trying to establish what you've learned. For example, you want to study a chapter from a book, okay? And this chapter in the book talks about building bridges, okay? So this book is a book about bridges, and you read a chapter about how to build a bridge. And this chapter is a pretty short chapter. It's not really going into the details, but it says that, okay, building a bridge is requires you take into consideration, say, these 6 steps. You have to take into consideration these 6 steps. And then he talks a little bit about each of these steps that engineers and contractors take into consideration when they want to build a bridge. When you passively learn this chapter, what your brain is doing, you go through the chapter, you read it, and your brain says, okay, I understand this. Okay, I get the second point. Okay, this makes sense. That's correct. I can interpret this point into another wording, and that's okay. That's I understand. And then you finish the chapter and say, okay, I understood the 6 essential steps of building a bridge. I interpreted them into my brain. Okay, I learned this chapter. Let's move on. That's passive learning. Your brain is actually doing a very little amount of effort. Okay, it's not as little as just hearing or listening, because these are not really learning methods, but it's doing the least amount of effort that someone would do to learn something. So in passive learning, you're just understanding and interpreting the source of information that you're getting, and you just want to move on. And this is an important problem. Many students and learners utilize passive learning. Why? Because it's satisfying. There's a very dangerous thing about passive learning, which is it provides you with a placebo effect. It makes your brain think that it has learned this subject, where in reality, you just understood that subject, you managed to interpret it in your brain and just can move on. So this placebo satisfaction effect is making you feel that you've actually learned the subject and is allowing you to move on to another subject and just finish the whole thing. In fact, most students just are, satisfied with this placebo effect, and they go to an exam thinking they've finished the whole thing. I've studied the whole book. I finished all chapters. I read them all. I understand them. I've interpreted them in my head, and now I'm ready for an exam. They go to the exam and actually are satisfied with their performance sometimes. But when the result comes out, they're surprised. The result is below what they have expected. And this is because there's a placebo satisfaction effect that passive learning is giving them. It makes you think that you can actually be examined about a subject. But the major flaw about passive learning is that it cannot really be able to give you enough learning to be examined about a subject. So in my opinion, passive learning is only useful for a social interaction where someone is trying to explain something to you and just want to, try to understand it. You have some curiosity about it, but you're not really involved or invested in that subject, and you never think that you would use it in your life. Or if you want to read a, book for fun, for your own entertainment, before bed, or you're reading a novel. This is where passive learning, in my opinion, should be used and only. However, in order to actually learn something and have a more, complex goal than just passing a social interaction or, be entertained by a book or a novel, you probably want to push your goal to a higher level. And when you learn something, your goals might be more complex than just passing time and understanding what you're reading. Your goals might be about, being examined in that subject, which is the case in most, students. You are learning this subject because you want to finish, the exam and just get it over with. Although in my opinion, you might want to push it a little further and, learn something in order to be able to use it in your life. And that would be like very important for your own improvement in life, for your career, for your work, etc. And sometimes, in my opinion, one of the highest goals, in terms of complexity is actually to be able to teach it. So these goals are more advanced, okay? And they need your brain, and they need you to invest more learning energy into your learning process. Passive learning is not compatible with these goals. It will not be able to satisfy such goals, be examined in a test, be able to use it in your life, and even teach it. Passive learning is not the tool. And that's where we go to active learning. Now, what is active learning? The simplest way, in my opinion, to describe active learning is when your brain feels exhausted after learning something. Pretty much like an exercise. If you're exercising, okay, you have like a weight, you're doing weightlifting, and this weight is just 1 kilogram or like 2 pounds, and you're just like exercising with it. By the end of your exercise, you don't really feel, tired or fatigued, or you're straining your muscles or anything, because this is a very small weight. You're not doing a lot of effort. And that's probably not very useful for your muscle and, your goals of exercise. Probably this is not always true when you talk about physical exertion, but I think it is always true when you talk about mental exertion. If a mental activity is making your brain feel tired, it's likely that your brain is actually learning. If a mental activity is not making your brain feel tired, you're probably not learning something. So when your brain is active, is consuming energy, you feel tired, you feel, and I'm not saying you're having a headache or something like that. You just feel that you have, consumed energy doing that, that activity. You feel hungry after it, you feel something was happening in your brain. This is when active learning is actually working. And active learning is very useful when your goals of your learning are, as I said before, when you want to be examined in that subject, when you probably want to teach that subject or use it in your life. In active learning, your brain is making an extra effort, it's trying to do stuff inside it while you're receiving the information from the source to be able to, retain this information and use it in more complicated, more demanding tasks like exams. And that's the difference between someone who's studying for an exam, getting good results, and someone who's studying even more for an exam and is not getting the results. It's being actively learning that. In my opinion, to say that you've actively learned something, you need to satisfy two main goals by the end of your learning process. You need to be able to recollect what you have learned, and you need to be able to explain what you have learned. And these are two very important parameters or measures of your learning process. Let's start with recollection. As the word implies, recollection is, revising, is being able to remember what we have learned. Now, recollection requires certain criteria, in my opinion, to be effective recollection or active recollection. For example, if you learned about, the steps of building a bridge from that book, which were like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps, you learned it, okay? And I'm asking you to recollect. What I'm asking you to do is not actually to recite what you've learned in that book. That's not what I'm asking. I don't want you to repeat the things that are written in the book. Why is that? Because books are written in a way that satisfies the fact that they are a book, okay? And it doesn't matter what source you're using, whether it's a book, whether it's a video, whether it's a lecture note, etc. All of these sources that we record, teaching elements in them, they are meant to be books, they are meant to be teaching sources, and they are monotonous. What I mean here is that they are just made of words, and they are organized in a way that can help them being recorded in a book. In other words, you don't really have to, organize your ideas the same way as a book is organizing it, because a book is just made of words, sometimes pictures. But your brain is way more fun. It's way more complicated. Your brain is more like a garden. Your brain is really not a monotone system. There are pictures, there are connections, there are sounds. There are so many different types of ideas that, have formed in your brain. And what I really want you to recollect is to try and use the ideas in your head rather than the ideas that were in the book. So I don't want you to recite what is in the book. Then how can I do that? How can I, bring things from my brain, not from the things that are, recorded in the book? And this is what I call interactive recollection. Interactive recollection requires that you try and dig in your head to find how accurate and how different your ideas are in your head. What I mean is that interactive recollection happens in the form of questioning. So instead of telling me of trying to recite the chapter as is, you need to ask yourself questions. For example, one of the questions would be, what is the most important principle that needs to be taken into consideration about when you build a bridge? From your understanding of that chapter, what is the most important principle? Okay, there are 7 points, but these 7 points probably are circulating, are trying to tell you that there's something very important that you have to think about when you build a bridge. I don't know about bridging, bridge building. So I might not know the most important principle, but an expert might actually be able to tell me that. And you might, if you read the chapter, you might actually come up with 1 or 2 principles that actually all of the points are actually talking about. And well, maybe the most important principle about a bridge is that this bridge is strong. I mean, it has to connect between 2 points. So what is the thing that is satisfying the strength of a bridge? Is it the location? Is it the height? Is it the material, etc.? So rephrasing your learning by asking questions that are not specifically answered in a clear way in the chapter itself is what I mean by interactive recollection. So what is the most important principle? Okay. What is a point that is not important? Okay, maybe that would be a useful question. What you do after the fifth step. You don't say fifth step, you say what's the step and what do you do after it? So this is how you interactively recollect a subject that you've studied. You try to transform it into questions and you try to answer these questions. This way, what you're actually trying to activate is not the chapter in your head, because your head is not really going to store the whole book. What it's going to store is the ideas, in your mind, and you try to recollect. Another important thing that you have to do when you recollect is leaving a space. Spaced recollection or spaced repetition. Okay? What do I mean by spaced recollection? Well, you might say that, okay, I learned the subject on Monday, and then I revise it on the following Monday, a week in between, which is kind of true. But when I say spaced recollection, I'm not only talking about time difference. I'm also talking about what happened during this week. And in my opinion, there's a big difference between a week that you spent doing no mental effort, you were on a vacation, for example, and a week where you studied other things. In my opinion, the more useful recollection is when there is a space between the two, points in time, and in between you studied other things. I sometimes refer to that as trying to distract yourself. So when your brain studied that subject, it started a thought, chain or a thought process. If you went on vacation or didn't study anything, and you tried to come back to this, thought chain, this is a pure memory work. Okay, you're just trying to remember something that happened a week ago, which sometimes is more difficult for some people and sometimes it's easier for other people. But if your brain was distracted by study of other subjects in between, these subjects will play either a positive role or a negative role in your recollection process. A positive role would happen if these subjects were actually connected to the thing that you studied at the first time. So you studied about the principles of building a bridge, and then you studied another chapter about the first principle, another chapter about the second principle, another chapter about the third principle. So in fact, all of these chapters were actually referring to the first chapter. And this will make it easier for you to actually recollect. In my opinion, this is better because now all of these are one chunk of thought in your head. Sometimes, however, they have a negative effect on recollection. If they are really not related to the subject and they are more of a distraction, still, that's a good thing because all the time there are things that will distract you before you get examined, about a certain subject. Will you still remember the original principle correctly despite distractions? Would you be able to distinguish between this subject and that subject? Because many times people study about something and then study study other things that are slightly similar to it. And when you ask them questions about these similar subjects, they start mixing things up. For example, you're a history student, and in your first lecture, you were studying about the history of, say, Slovakia, okay, which is a country in Europe. But in the following lectures, you studied the history of Serbia, studied the history of Slovenia, you studied the history of Hungary, etc. And for some reason, your brain started mixing things up. Was it Slovenia that had this? Was it Slovakia that had this? So it is important to sometimes have distracting information in between to actually test how good you're remembering that. And when you do this, spaced recollection, your brain will start actually comparing between subjects that you have not compared between before. So the two key elements of an active recollection, as I said, is that this recollection is both interactive, meaning it involves questioning, and spaced in terms of time and content. The second element, in my opinion, of active learning is to be able to explain something. And this is very important. Explaining, in my world, in my approach to it, is in fact a spectrum. The simplest form of explanation is just, tell me the subject, just explain it to me. At one point, which is a higher level of that spectrum, is actually to be able to teach it to someone, to be able to rephrase the concept in a very easy wording and be able to deliver the idea in a simple fashion that will help you teach it to someone, and usually be able to teach it to someone who is educationally below you in a level. As the general concept, can you explain this to a 5-year-old? Can you simplify this concept enough that a 5-year-old would actually get a grasp of it? If you can do that, you're actually going into a higher level of explanation. In my opinion, the highest level of explanation is actually to be able to use this concept. For example, if you are hired as part of a team who's going to build a project, you're actually going to be a useful member. I'm not saying you have to be able to build a bridge, because that's not explained in one chapter, but at least be a useful member, to be able to know the most important principles of bridge building, what are the materials that you might think of, how it should look like, and etc. So this is the highest level of explanation, and you don't really need to expect from yourself to be able to do these higher levels. But if you just can't explain it, and what do I mean by explain it? Explaining a subject is to rephrase it in a fashion that simplifies it, and essentially to get the concepts out of it as well as the details. And this explanation should be different in many ways from the source, from the book. It has to be different, it has to be in your own words, and it has to be even easier to understand and to approach. And this is very important. And let me give you an example of explanation that will make it more practical. So one of the most commonly used tools in studying is summary. To make a summary, I see many students, they go get the book or the source, the video or whatever it is. Okay, so that's the source. And they decide, they have a chapter which is like 15 pages, and they summarize it into 2 pages, which is very nice work. They summarize it, they use colors, they use drawings, etc. But there's a big problem with this method. If you're doing the summarization while you're studying the chapter for the first time, while you're looking at the source, what you're doing, in my opinion, is known as destructive summary. The person who wrote this chapter thought that 15 pages should be enough to explain it, because this book is actually a product of explanation. It's a product of active learning. And this person decided that 15 pages is enough for someone who's learning to understand the concepts. What you're doing now, without even having a good grasp of the subject, without having enough active learning of the subject, you're removing 13 pages from that chapter almost randomly to just turn it into 2 pages. Of course, you're not doing that randomly. You're not just removing 13 pages. You're just trying to simplify and remove excess detail. But what you're doing is destructive, in my opinion, because at this level, you still don't know the principles and the essential concepts of the subject. And by doing that, you might actually remove certain details that you think at this point are not important, but actually are very essential for you to get the whole picture. So you're removing a lot of the important picture, and you're ruining the source of information for yourself. This destructive summary is an example of passive learning, because actually to do a summary of this sort, you're not doing a lot of mental work. You're just looking at the book as it is, trying to remove all of the excess information and turn it into a shorter version for you to study later on. This is passive learning, and it's even worse sometimes than passive learning because it has a destructive element. In my opinion, the correct way to summarize something is to actively summarize it. So what you do is you study the subject, and then later on you have spaced interactive recollection. And when you do this recollection, you can restudy the subject and see what did I miss, and then have a better recollection, and then restudy, and then a better recollection, etc. Sometimes only one cycle is enough, sometimes more. And when you reach a effective recollection of the subject, now you need to rephrase it into an explanation. And when you do this correct explanation, the source should not be your reference. Your reference is your recollection. The idea is in your head. And you make a summary that can actually be only 2 pages, but actually contain the most essential pieces of information that will be able to answer the questions for you. This kind of explanation is, in my opinion, much better than the summaries that are done passively. You need to pay attention that these methods of active learning are directed toward being examined in the subject, being able to teach it, and potentially use it. In exams, you are questioned. And this questioning is requiring your recollection of memories and also the ability to explain. Because exams are not expecting you to just passively remember all of the 6 points of building a bridge. It is expecting you to be able to understand where these points are coming from. So they want you to explain why these points are correct and why the other points are wrong. So actually your explanation might not only be 2 pages, it might sometimes be 30 pages. And in my opinion, this is even better than a summary. When you can extrapolate information from a smaller source, this means that you've understood the rationale, the logic behind the idea. Now you can write 6 things that you should not do when you build a bridge. You can actually understand the bridge that is near your house, how it was built and how these principles are applied to it or sometimes not applied to it. So you can give examples. You can construct a more complex understanding of the subject with correct explanation. And many times, people who write tests try to figure out whether you actually could grasp this parallel information. So that's what I call any extra pages that you can add to this chapter is parallel information that you have generated with enough recollection and explanation. You now understand fully what you have learned, and you can actually make new information. And in many occasions, the test will contain questions about things that you did not really find in the chapter. And only a person who managed to really understand where these concepts are coming from is able to answer it. When you teach the subject and your student is kind of interested, he might ask you a question. And that question is not necessarily answered in the book that you've read. But if you understand the subject enough, you can be able to answer it. And when you use it in real life, well, there are all sorts of questions that can arise and the book is unable to answer. But if you really understand what you're doing, you will be able to improvise. So this is pretty much my idea of active learning. There are many methods with which you can apply these concepts, and there's not enough time to explain it in this video. In fact, what I really want you to do is try to use active learning with this very video. I want you to try to recollect what are the ideas that have been explained in it, and try to explain it to a friend. And in fact, try to extrapolate new ideas, parallel ideas where you can, give examples of ways you can apply active learning and ways where you cannot apply active learning. And until then, we might meet in the future with another video, hopefully in the near future. So thank you very much for watching, and see you